Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopoulos Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm Connor Savoy. I'm a senior fellow here with the Project on Prosperity and Development. Thanks for joining us today. Today's event is engaging the private sector for innovative global development. We're proud to do this today in partnership with our friends at Notre Dame. This is a topic that CSIS has long viewed as important, seeing the private sector as a vital partner to helping drive long-term sustainable economic growth across the developing world. 9 out of 10 jobs are created by the private sector, and the majority of U.S. engagement today with developing countries is private sector-led through either foreign direct investment, philanthropy, and other charitable engagement. I think at the outset, it's important for us to define what we mean by the private sector. And in today's discussion, we're going to take a broad definition. This can be everything from multinational corporations, investors, charity, philanthropy, and other types of private sector actors. And I think it's not just the American private sector. I think increasingly we also mean the local private sector. And again, that can mean everything from local investors, local companies, local NGOs, local civil society. USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the U.S. government's principal development agency, has been a leading voice in engaging the private sector, having pioneered a public-private partnership model through its global development alliances starting in the early 2000s. Under GDA, the USAID has engaged a variety of multinational corporations and other private sector actors, including Chevron, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Walmart, to name a few, to pool resources to advance development objectives. The early GDAs yielded measurable results for economic development, improved health outcomes, food security, and nutrition. But there were clear limitations to the GDA model, including a sense that the private sector was seen largely as just a checkbook and not as a genuine partner for USAID, as someone who could be engaged on their knowledge and local engagements. Under Ambassador Mark Green's leadership, when he served as USAID administrator in the last administration, USAID substantially updated its private sector engagement policy. We have one of the authors of that policy on our panel today. But really, the PSE policy that emerged in 2018 really sought to take a more holistic view of what engagement might look like. And this included mobilizing private capital for scale, looking at how market-based solutions could drive greater sustainability of development outcomes, using USAID's resources as more of a catalytic tool, and really increasing and deepening that collaboration with the private sector across. So to really unpack this, I'm joined today by a great panel. This includes Paul Perrin, the Director of Evidence and Learning at Notre Dame, Melissa Paulson, who's the Program Director for Entrepreneurship and Education at Notre Dame, Sarah Glass, the Senior Director for Private Sector Engagement at the World Wildlife Fund, and also formerly USAID's lead on private sector engagement, Richard Crespin, the CEO of Collaborate Up, and also a Senior Associate here at CSIS, and finally Jennifer Billings, who's the Global Agricultural Lead at Corteva Agriscience. To kick off our discussion today, Paul and Melissa are going to present on some of their work. I would say academic institutions have really played a leading role in strengthening the work of government agencies, development organizations, and private companies to help create more effective partnerships. We're going to hear from Paul and Melissa on some of the work that Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs has been doing as part of an initiative launched by USAID that sought to bring together academic research and development to help USAID address many of the key challenges they see in priority countries. So with that, I'll turn it over to Paul and Melissa, who have a short presentation, and then we'll kick it off with a panel discussion. Paul and Melissa, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's an honor to be with all of you today. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be, and thank you for joining us today. And it's my honor to be able to present and share some work that we have done as part of a large consortium called the Laser Pulse Consortium. This is a funding mechanism that has emerged out of USAID's Higher Education Solutions Network. And this really is a partnership of a number of different institutions. You'll see the logos of whom are at the bottom here. We will be presenting on the University of Notre Dame's piece of this, but there's a larger body of work that must be acknowledged here. The impetus for this work was really USAID's private sector engagement strategy. And that strategy really laid the framework for some groundbreaking work in private sector engagement. The strategy was formed on 4 operational principles, and I think Sarah, we're really grateful to have Sarah with us today, who can speak to the driving forces behind this strategy. But one of the 4 operating principles in this strategy was that USAID seeking to build and act on evidence of what works and what doesn't in private sector engagement. And that operational principle, in turn, led to the formulation of the Private Sector Engagement Evidence and Learning Plan. This was formalized in May of 2019, so it's been in effect for about 2 years. And some of the activities that we will be describing today emerged out of the activities described in the Evidence and Learning Plan. Essentially, the plan lays the framework for understanding what the evidence is, what existing evidence is, and also generating new and important evidence that can be used in engaging the private sector. And I'd like to begin by sharing with you that initial piece around understanding the state of the evidence as it relates to private sector engagement. And the activity that we will describe today and show you, and this is a tool that anyone can use, it's open access, it's intended for as wide an audience as possible, and we encourage all of you on this call or this webinar to engage with this tool because you can help us make it better. The evidence gap map is a way of consolidating the evidence and trying to structure it in such a way that people can distill it to the evidence that is most relevant to their work. And as we went about trying to design this evidence gap map, which I will show you in a few minutes, we also tried to understand what intended uses might there be for such a body and corpus of evidence. And we also intended this to be equally applicable not only to development actors, but also to private sector actors, as well as academic actors. And these are some of the use cases that we articulated during the design phase of the evidence gap map. And it ranges everywhere from designing a project or a program, if that's one of your roles, to identifying existing or potential engagements, getting a sense of what is out there and what other people have done to help get the juices flowing for those of you who might be seeking to forge partnerships, identifying research and evaluation opportunities as a way to help everyone contribute to this evidence base. And so these are the different uses. And hopefully, as you look at this, you find yourself in one of these use cases. And so we wanted to ask you, and there's a live questions tab on the CSIS website linked with this particular event. And you can feel free to put your thoughts in there, or you can use this purely as an intellectual exercise for yourself. But the question is, if you're in the development or nonprofit sector, how would you describe your evidence needs as they relate to your work in private sector engagement? We would like to understand what evidence needs you have in your particular work. In other words, what information do you need to move forward or improve your project or your organization? Think about that and reflect on that as we walk you through the tool. Now, it's important for me to state that my own intellectual formation, as I went through my educational activities and early career, It was formed in an environment that was deeply skeptical of the private sector. And if you had told me 10 years ago that I would be speaking about private sector engagement, I would have chuckled, because it was such a strong anti-private sector bias in those early years of my formation. And there are various reasons for that, but I don't believe that many of those reasons were actually formed in a solid body of evidence. And each of us in this webinar come to the table with different biases, different agendas that we might have. And it's important to reflect on this call in the private sector engagement strategy. It's not to build and act on biases or agendas. That's not what the wording states. The wording is to build and act on evidence of what works and what doesn't. And I'm grateful for that call, because it's helped me see what many others have seen much earlier than I did in my formation, which is that the private sector isn't the problem. The private sector can be a critical partner in the work of global development. And so as we engage with USAID and other partners, this is the process whereby the tool that we will show you shortly was created. We started with a design workshop to understand the uses, as were just articulated, to understand the intended users, and the types of evidence that would be useful in order to meet those use cases. And then we worked with USAID to co-create the Evidence Gap Map framework. EGM is a shorthand for Evidence Gap Map. We then designed a document categorization matrix, so every single piece of evidence that is in the Evidence Gap Map has been read and categorized using certain points of information that help the user to hone in on the information that's useful for them. We also devised a document search strategy using various document types. It's not just journal articles, but we're looking at industry publications, evaluation documents, etc. And then we coded all of those documents in accordance with the document categorization matrix. Currently, there are around 600 materials in there. This is a corpus that we intend to see grow. All of you can help contribute to that. And we also did double coding, so with unique and distinct users to help validate that categorization. And so I wanted to show you now what this tool looks like, just very briefly. This is the Evidence Gap Map tool. Again, this is open access. Anyone on this call can access this. And you'll see that it is in the form of a matrix. And for those of you familiar with the USAID private sector engagement strategy, you should see some familiar language here, because it's built around the parameters that are in that strategy, around the ways that the private sector and development actors can engage with one another, which represent the rows of this tool. And then the columns articulate the value propositions to the private sector as well as development actors, the value that these actors bring to this engagement. And so each document that's in the corpus has been coded to fit within this matrix. There are also filters that enable users to distill the evidence base in ways that are useful to them. So for instance, if I am a program manager in Asia seeking to do an engagement in the area of climate change, I might distill this corpus down to represent Asia, and there's a technical sector here around environment and climate change. And I might be particularly interested in ways to achieve scale, sustainability, and reach while catalyzing private sector resources. So I can pull this up, and this then shows the corpus of documents that are relevant to that use case. And so I could pull up a document, for instance, this one around scoping study to identify emission reduction opportunities, and it will have key findings, key recommendations, the internet URL, and a link to then view that particular document. So every document in the corpus has a landing page that is similar to this. And so the hope is then by developing this tool, we enable different actors, whether in the private sector, development sector, or even researchers, to start to make sense of the existing evidence base. The last thing I wanted to show you is that we see this evidence gap map as a living resource, and it's only as good as the information that's included herein. And many of you have access to evidence that you use or have contributed to. And so we encourage everyone to help fill the gaps. If you see that there's a document that you're aware of that is not in the corpus, you have the ability to submit that document for inclusion by clicking on the link of the form at the bottom, which will then take you to this form to fill out that will notify us so that we can include it in the evidence gap map. And so there are additional instructions. There's a frequently asked questions at the top. I'm not going to go into training on how to use the tool. I just wanted to give you an initial introduction to it. And so when we talk about evidence gaps in the evidence gap map, what we're really looking at are absolute gaps where there is no evidence available in a certain intersection, or even relative gaps where there may be some evidence, but it's not at the same level as some of the other intersections. But it's also an evidence map that enables you to use the evidence. So some of you may be thinking, I can contribute to this, I can help fill gaps, and others of you may be saying, I want to use the evidence that exists in my work. And so that's a quick introduction to the evidence gap map, and I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Melissa to speak about another tool that has been developed as part of the evidence and learning strategy. Melissa, over to you.
Good morning, and thank you, Paul. So I want to also thank Connor and Jennifer, Richard and Sarah for this opportunity to be with you talking about increasing development effectiveness, because I think that's exactly what we're trying to do through private sector partnerships. And similar to Paul, I come to this work not as a researcher per se, but as an educator and a practitioner. But my career started in the private sector. And I continue to work with necessity and opportunity-driven entrepreneurs who are addressing unique product and/or service challenges and who are trying to achieve financial sustainability. These entrepreneurs, the private sector, also want to have impact in their communities. And that might include improving access to employment, among other outputs and outcomes. So I just wanted to kind of frame that for you. Paul, if you could move to the slide with the question. So before moving into the background and the actual tool, similar to Paul, I'm wondering if you could assist us by answering a question. Specifically, if you're in the private sector or have worked closely with the private sector, how do you measure environmental, social, and governance, or what we call ESG outcomes? And this can be a thought exercise similar to Paul's. And if you use one ESG framework or more, it would be helpful if you could indicate which one. And you can go to the live questions on the CSIS website to provide your answer. Bonus points if you actually do, because this will be very useful feedback for us. So Paul, if you could go to the next slide. And I actually can't see the slide, so I'm a little in the dark here. So on this slide, we should be showing you the TOC, or the theory of change, for the work that we've been doing. So in addition to filling a critical knowledge gap and improving the rigor of private sector research, this includes a perspective study, a failure risk analysis, and an enduring results study that are undertaken by our partners at Purdue and CRS. USAID also wanted to take an iterative approach to evolving, expanding, and deepening their collaboration with the private sector. So our theory of change for this work, and I'll just read it because I think it's an important foundation for the work. If USAID identifies market-based opportunities that are additional and engages with the private sector for development and humanitarian objectives, and effectively manages private sector relationships, then outcomes will be improved. So all of our work was basically built off of this foundation. So essentially, there is tremendous shared value when both sectors meaningfully and effectively partner. And our work has focused on helping to articulate and operationalize that value. The accompanying tools in development are highlighted in yellow, and I'll just kind of quickly indicate them. we're creating what we're calling ways we engage indicators to better monitor and thereby understand engagement with the private sector. And these have been developed and are being hopefully added to the database as we speak. We're working, or at least have provided a foundation for an additionality tool to help identify market failures, and which can inform the additionality of USAID intervention. Part of this work is about building relationships and trust. And so we've worked on a relationship health checklist and scorecard in terms of how the development sector relates to the private sector. And finally, the tool that I'll be sharing a little bit more about today is a harmonizing indicators tool that maps existing business relevant indicators to standard US foreign assistance indicators. All of these tools contribute to better understanding private sector motivations and needs, and improve private sector monitoring approaches, and identify and encourage engagement opportunities. So if we could kind of, I still can't see the slide, so I'm hoping that we're on why harmonize. So this is the next slide. And it's basically, our engagement has always focused on increasing this mutual understanding between development organizations and the private sector. So as we worked alongside USAID to identify meaningful indicators for PSE effectiveness or private sector engagement effectiveness, there was also the recognition that the indicators and tools should utilize a common language and be of relevance to private sector partners. That is, we wanted to create a crosswalk demonstrating alignment of interest. And as you can see from this slide, there's an overlap between these interests. Whereas Paul was talking earlier about kind of those original biases, there's actually significant overlap between what the private sector wants to achieve as well as what development wants to achieve. If we move on to the next slide, this is on ESG reporting. Now, numerous environmental, social, and governance, or ESG frameworks, have emerged over the last several decades to help investors and companies alike in the measurement of their company or portfolio performance. Now, I just want to clarify, many people in the audience likely know this, but just to make sure that we're all clear, ESG is different from corporate social responsibility in that CSR represents a company's efforts to have a positive impact on its employees, customers, and environment, and the wider community. It's the actions that they're taking, while ESG looks beyond the ethical action and examines the roles of these factors on the long-term financial performance of the firms. So such reporting initiatives, and this is not an exhaustive list, mind you, include Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, SASB, etc. In addition, the private sector is attentive to the Sustainable Development Goals. Many companies are mapping to the SDGs because they're relevant, straightforward, and widely understood. So let's jump into the actual tool. This is the background for it. So we created a tool that would harmonize indicators across the private and global development sectors. And this should be the next slide. And we started with two related but distinct critical considerations. We wanted to determine the initial set of indicators to harmonize, and we wanted to systematize the process of determining which indicators are considered a fit. We developed a methodology and tool whereby USAID staff and private sector partners can examine pertinent illustrative indicator linkages. And we produced an algorithm through a text mining process, a little bit in the weeds here, which allows for a set of criteria that could extract important indicators across the various ESG repositories. And so that's what this tool is in front of you. Both due to their popularity among companies and investors and their publicly accessible indicators, we decided to start with GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, SASB, IRIS Plus, and a smaller framework called Business Call to Action, or BCTA. The tool can be sorted according to the business theme, business indicator source, or the USG's SBSD categories or program areas. And by way of demonstration, allow me to share a sample use case from the perspective of a USAID mission program officer. This program officer might want to invite private sector organizations to participate in planning and implementing market-based solutions to achieve the USAID goals. She might access this tool to find common indicators that are relevant to achieving clean drinking water, for example. She can open the tool and filter by relevant categories until she identifies a small group of indicators that measure access to clean drinking water. If we could move on to the next slide. Perhaps the USAID officer is interested in partnering with a health-related firm. And these are two actual companies, Medtronic and Twiga, but they don't necessarily represent a partnership that exists. This is just for illustrative purposes only. But specifically, Medtronic is a global leader in medical technology, services, and solutions. They create insulin pumps, for example. And they've been focused on product and process innovations, which lead to improved patient outcomes and reduced costs. They draw from GRI, SASB, and other frameworks in their ESG reporting. The program officer can use the tool to look for business relevant indicators in the health sector, as well as learn more about the business indicator sources like GRI. Her objective is to generate a common set of indicators that both she and the private sector can consider while creating an opportunity, including as part of a joint monitoring plan. And finally, the next slide, slide 8, on the Twiga use case, the mission officer may be interested in partnering with a company like Twiga, a company in Kenya that buys fresh produce directly from smallholder farmers through rural aggregation centers, and they sell the produce to city vendors. This is another illustrative example of how the mission officer can consult the tool to determine business relevant agricultural indicators that can be used in linguistically aligning with a private sector partner such as Twiga. And finally, the next slide, what's next? Well, the tool has been developed, as you can see, and it can be accessed. If you're interested, we'll give you a link. The next phase is to focus on finalizing the tool and expanding it to include the SDGs, which we think are very important and relevant, and map additional frameworks into the tool. We're creating a user guide that will be based on feedback received from target users, and we encourage both USAID and the private sector to reach out to us with those with particular illustrative examples. And we're soliciting that feedback and through a form that we have on the site. So I'm going to close for now and pass it on back to Connor and to our other panelists. But thank you very much for listening and for hopefully engaging with us in the future as we finalize this and our other tools.
Thank you, Paul and Melissa. That was very comprehensive and a great overview of the work that you're doing, and I think really demonstrates, how a partnership in its own way, or how engagement with someone outside the government can really help drive the creation of useful tools that can enhance the broader engagement with the private sector. I want to go to the panel now. We've got, as I said, Sarah Glass, Jennifer Billington, Chris Mead, and really give them an opportunity to respond to what they've heard, as all three of them are obviously experts in this area, and I think can really help us understand what we heard from Paul and Melissa. So, Sarah, if I could maybe put you on the spot, given your previous role at USAID and your role in driving the PSE policy. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you just heard, but also, this question of evidence of what works and what doesn't work. This has become a sort of central focus for development actors to really better understand, the impact that we're achieving or the impact that we're not achieving, and how we can use that to better improve future program design and that sort of thing. So maybe if I could ask you to just reflect a little bit on what you heard and how you think these tools could be used by folks at AID going forward.
I'm happy to. Connor and CSIS for hosting this discussion, and thanks Melissa and Paul for your work and your presentation. I also want to give credit to Kathy Raskowski, who was at USAID and has since moved on to be a part of the sustainability team at McCormick, but who I know worked with you on this work, and of course Carl Fickencher and Michael Metzler and the incredible team at USAID who are continuing to carry forward this work. The reason that I think this work is so important is that partnering, and particularly partnering with the private sector, is hard. How many times have you said to yourself, just when you were doing something, I could reach out and I could work with others on this, but it will be just easier if I just do it myself. And there are a lot of things that are easier if you just do it yourself, faster, but not necessarily better. And that was the whole, I think, premise behind USAID's focus on private sector engagement, is that it's not necessarily easier to do it in partnership with the private sector, but that it is in fact better, that it is more sustainable, that you have greater scale, that you are able to bring unique expertise of the private sector to the work. And so if we were going to make that claim, that in fact the work would be better in all these different ways, then the question is, where is the evidence to prove that? And if we're going to focus on partnering with the private sector, which is harder, let's make sure that it is definitely better. And so I think that as you lay out this, both the evidence gap map and then the work looking forward at indicators, I think it's important to look at what we know today about where and how it is better and where it's not, and be really candid and have a really candid conversation about that. And I think one of the things I'm hopeful about this work looking forward is that now that USAID has this framework, that the quality of the evidence can indeed get better over time. You were able to pull together, a huge amount of sort of different bodies of work that present some evidence, but we know that a lot of that evidence is incomplete. It's anecdotal, where it could be more rigorous. It's important, I think, always to make sure that that we're not spending more time and effort on collecting evidence than we are having value to the actual development and business objectives that we're trying to achieve. But overall, still, there needs to be much more rigor, and the quality of the evidence needs to improve. And then the other thing that I think, as we look at this sort of looking forward, is that hopefully this gives teams on the development side, whether it's USAID or other development actors, and teams on the private sector side, some grounding and a push to really start a partnership from the outset to say, what do we each individually bring to the table? Why are we working together? And what do we want to achieve? And let's be intentional about that from the outset, so that we are really clear. Here's what we're bringing. Here's how we're going to measure and hold ourselves accountable. Did we really bring that? And here are the outputs that we're looking to achieve and deliver. And did we truly deliver that? Was it truly better? So I'm excited to hear you say that there is a plan to add the SDGs to this, because I think that is an organizing framework that both the development sector and the private sector are using as we look at this work. And I think that it will also be useful as the framework gets used more, to really have conversations. I'm excited we have Jennifer on this call, but to have real hard conversations with the private sector partners as part of the equation about what are they trying to achieve, and are their indicators reflected here, and can we make sure that they are? Because if you start a partnership and you have different indicators or success metrics that you haven't agreed upon from the outset, that can be a recipe for disaster. But it can also be a real recipe for success if you're both, even if you have aligned success metrics that are different, but you're both trying to help each other achieve those success metrics, and it's really clear what those metrics are. I think that can be a real recipe for success in a partnership. So I am excited about this work as a way to provide an organizing framework and sort of an impetus for making sure that those conversations happen going forward.
Thanks, Sarah. That's great, and maybe that's a good segue to go to Jennifer to get your views on, a little bit of what Sarah was just saying about do you see this as a tool that will help tackle some of those organizing challenges, and the ensuring that you have an understanding from the outset of what the objectives are, what you're bringing to and what you can each partner can bring to the table. So Jennifer, would love your views on this and on the broader what we heard from Paul and Melissa.
Thank you, Connor, and thank you for including me here today. And thank you so much to Melissa and Paul for what they shared about this interesting new tool. And glad to be here together with Richard and Sarah for this topic that I am personally incredibly passionate about and have worked on my entire career. I think that public-private partnerships are critical, absolutely critical to achieving the objectives of international development. And I think that going more into the future, we will see an even better integration between the public and private sector around development objectives and the SDGs, particularly in the areas of agriculture and health. And I think agriculture is obviously the area where I work the most, and we are not achieving the SDG 2 goal of zero hunger. In fact, for the third year in a row, global hunger is on the rise. And I think it's more important than ever that public and private sector come together in order to be able to achieve the ambitious goals around zero hunger related to productivity of smallholder farmers, related to poverty reduction, related to more sustainable farming and climate adaptation, et cetera. I think this tool is great, and I think that there is always an opportunity to have I remember the term when I was at USAID, the learning agenda, and to be able to learn and adapt and really base that all in evidence is exciting. I also think that a lot of how partnerships are developed and advanced in this space is around individual relationships and trust building. So it's important to have a point of reference for the evidence, but I think at the end of the day, USAID has an incredible role to play in being a convener between the public and private sector to build those relationships, build that trust. And I also think that's something that's done over time. We at Corteva, for those of you who don't know, we're the largest global agriculture company. We are in 142 countries. And we have 50 million smallholder farmer customers. And you asked about ESG, Melissa. I'm proud to share that just this past year, we set 14 very ambitious sustainability goals, as well as a set of inclusion and diversity goals that are linked to our ESG reporting. And we, within those goals, we have a goal of increasing the productivity, incomes, and sustainable farming practices of 500 million smallholder farmers. So that's just one of our very ambitious goals. And we recognize that certainly we will not achieve those goals alone. It is critical for us to have partners across the world, including USAID, in order to achieve those goals. But when I think about development, I think about scale, and I think about the importance of it being market-led solutions. I think, Sarah, you are an architect behind some of that language, and I love that language because I really think that it's so critical for the sustainable achievement of the development goals to make sure that it is a lot of the interventions are market-led. And that's where Corteva comes in. We have scale, without a doubt, and we are the market. So I think it makes a lot of sense. The partnerships we have with USAID, we have about 10 active ones around the world. And we've seen already a lot of impact and evidence related to those that have allowed those partnerships to go from one partnership that started in Ethiopia in 2013 to the 10 active ones that we have now. And that gets back to that relationship building and trust. And some of those results include 300% increases in productivity with 600,000 smallholder farmers in Tanzania on a very big USAID Feed the Future partnership, as well as doubling of incomes through that partnership. And I truly believe those outcomes would not have been achieved if it was not for the partnership efforts. And I think Feed the Future and agriculture, like I said, particularly lends itself to partnerships because agriculture is a business industry. And I think, Melissa, someone mentioned entrepreneurs, and I think of smallholder farmers as entrepreneurs, and they are absolutely looking to invest in their own small businesses. And a key part of investing is technology. And again, that's where Corteva comes in, because we have extensive R&D capabilities to develop technologies that are critical for increasing the productivity and allowing smallholder farmers to be more climate adaptive. And that's something that not just us, but a lot of private sector partners bring to the table that certainly is not a role that government plays. And then I also just wanted to make sure to mention implementing partners, because I think they're such a huge part of the ecosystem of the work that USAID does. And I think that, they're really, for us, they've been extremely critical to developing partnerships across the world. The trust that we've built with partners like Global Communities and ACDI Boca and CNFA and others has allowed us to hit the ground running on a lot of new partnerships, because the folks there are very familiar with what it is that Corteva brings to the table, and the impact that we can have in terms of achieving the goals. And also, one last thing was I wanted to mention that circle diagram. I think double win is great, but triple win's even better. I think the win for the farmers also is in there. So it's not just the development outcomes, but the achievement, the impact on the beneficiaries and the benefit they get out of these partnerships really makes them the triple win. So thank you for including me here today and for all the work that you all are doing to advance public-private partnerships in this space. I think it's just absolutely critical.
Thank you, Jennifer. I want to bring Richard in, but just before I go to Richard, I do want to encourage the audience, if you have any questions, to drop those into the chat. We are going to have a chance to go to get to some of, we'd love to get to some audience Q&A first. But Richard, you're the CEO of Collaborate Up, and you've had a lot of experience in designing and implementing multi-stakeholder and multi-sector partnerships. Love to get your reflections on this tool, where you see it as helping make it easier. As Sarah indicated, this is hard, but would love to get your views on that and where and anything else that stood out to you as you've listened to this great conversation so far.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Connor. And thanks to all my fellow panelists and to CSIS as well. I'd start off by saying I really want to acknowledge what Paul said at the beginning about bias against the private sector. That is, Paul, you're not alone in that. And I think that is still an issue that we contend with in international development. And one of the things I really value about this tool and this perspective that you bring is that you are taking the perspective of the private sector and incorporating it directly into what you're doing. I often find all of us are somewhat self-centered and tend to look at things through our own views. And donors and USAID are not alone in that either. And many of the measurement systems that are currently being used are very donor-centric or very self-centered. And so taking this sort of more harmonizing approach, I think, is really useful. Using the SDGs as a backdrop for that is also very useful. We have seen really broad acceptance by the SDGs in the private sector. I have a former life as a rater of companies on their ESG approaches. I used to run Corporate Responsibility Magazine and our 100 Best Corporate Citizens list, which was largely based on GRI type disclosures. So I have a fondness for that, but I also know that there are some weaknesses in those reporting frameworks and systems. But as a starting point, I think it's a really good one and one that we should continue to encourage. I'd also second what Sarah said about only collaborating on those things where you really need collaboration. My company's name is Collaborate Up. Collaborate's in our name, but I would tell you, if you don't have to collaborate, don't. Please do it on your own if you can. Because collaboration is not easy. It takes extra time, it takes extra resources, and it takes using tools like this to make it more effective. So if you can go alone, But if you're really trying to leverage your impact or have a broader impact, you may need to involve extra partners, especially in these kinds of situations. The last thing I'll say is that I would really encourage both Melissa and Paul and their organizations and all of us collectively to think about the boring stuff, to think about contracting. Because if you can't contract for it, you can't do it. And a grant is nothing more than a fancy contract. So I wrote a piece recently for CSIS on what I entitled Radical Co-Creation, and thinking about how we could incorporate not just the views of the private sector, but directly the beneficiaries that we're trying to help. And Jennifer mentioned the smallholder farmers as entrepreneurs, and thinking about how we can use them and bring them in early in program design, so that when we're talking about evidence, we're talking about evidence that is coming from the communities themselves. Do they agree with these goals? Are they willing to say that, yes, those goals were achieved or not? And then linking payments and linking contract terms to the achievement of those goals as defined by the various stakeholders, including the private sector and the communities. So thinking about how we can contract for it and to build it in, to move towards more pay for results, pay for performance, and fixed awards, I think could really benefit from the kinds of evidence-based approaches that you're putting forward here. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Richard. Provocative as always. I like your idea of radical co-creation, and maybe to pick up on that a little bit, I'd love to get this question of incorporating the beneficiaries. And Paul and Melissa, I'd love to sort of get your take on this as you've looked at this. You've tried to create this evidence gap map. Do you see a way to kind of bring that in, to bring that perspective into what you're trying to do? And then Sarah and Jennifer, I'd love your views on this issue. Sarah, in particular, on radical co-creation and your experiences at AID and how that might go forward. But Paul and Melissa, I'd love to hear your reactions on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's an idea that is really gaining traction, not just in private sector engagement, but I think in global development as a whole. We're starting to see a lot more evidence of local ownership and engagement as really being a driving force between achieving those types of outcomes. And so you'll see some of that in the map, but I think this is the frontier that we're engaging in now, more broadly at the Pulte Institute, not just with this project, but just in general. How do we foster radical engagement with the field? How do we foster local ownership, both at the community level, but at the country level as well? These are the types of questions that we really are seeking to generate evidence around. So I think you're spot on. I think it's an important consideration, and I think it's where the field as a whole is headed.
And I just wanted to echo Paul's thoughts, but also thank you, Richard and Sarah and Jennifer, for your comments as well. One thing I want, the SDGs, that's definitely something that we want to incorporate into our tool and definitely kind of want to continue to push for, because we need to acknowledge and recognize that ESG frameworks are not necessarily used by all private sector organizations. It's where it was our starting point, but we recognize national, regional, local private sector organizations may be tracking some type of impact metrics, but they're not necessarily using ESG frameworks. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And I also one other thing I want to acknowledge is along with partnerships, co-creation takes time. So and absolutely we want to engage beneficiaries, communities. It's the ground from which we should be working, or the kind of building off of. But we also have to acknowledge that it takes time to do so. Part of the work that we've been doing has taken some time because we've been kind of co-creating alongside USAID, as well as taking into consideration in the private sector who's a beneficiary, to be honest, in this work, as well as other communities. So I just wanted to, thank you for that comment, but also acknowledge if we're not ready to kind of like put the time in, then it's not going to work. So partnerships, co-creation, both of those things kind of go hand in hand.
Sarah, would love to get your take on this question of sort of local, engaging the local beneficiaries, but also this idea of radical co-creation.
Yeah, I have two separate thoughts I want to share. So one on the question of engaging local communities. Connor, you started with the stat that 9 out of 10 jobs in the developing world are now in the private sector. But I don't believe that, and it's an important stat, but I don't believe that stat includes the informal economy. And the informal economy is huge. And we know that one of the potential benefits of increasing collaboration with the private sector can be both to connect the formal economy to the informal economy, and also, of course, to grow the formal economy, because we know that there are benefits by bringing more people into the formal economy. So I think this is one of the things that I meant when we think about the framework for our evidence on private sector engagement potentially evolving over time, is that engaging the informal economy, engaging local communities is critically important. And the indicators that we focus on, the success metrics that we focus on there, may change and may need to be updated as we do that. And so I think that it's important to just keep that evolution sort of front and center, particularly as we focus on really important things like engaging local communities. So that's one thought. And then my second thought on this question of radical co-creation picks up on something that Richard said, which is that today, when USAID does public-private partnerships, they are largely legal contracts, right? They are grant agreements, they're legal contracts. And one of the things that I was really excited to see recently in the president's FY22 budget request and in Administrator Powers' remarks to the Hill was a push for more contracting officers at USAID. You may not know that today the average contracting officer at USAID manages a $65 million portfolio compared to the average portfolio at the Department of Defense as $15 million. When you're managing a $15 million or a $65 million portfolio, it's really hard to be innovative. It's really hard to build in sort of new ways of working and working with lots of additional partners. And so I think bringing on additional contracting officers and also bringing on contracting officers who potentially have a private sector background, have a motivation to be creative about ways that USAID programs its funds in collaboration with the private sector, are really trained and incentivized around that, is one of the biggest things that USAID can do in terms of advancing its agenda around private sector engagement to improve its overall development results.
That's a great, and Sarah, just not to underscore your point, but think about the differences between the procurement and acquisition budgets between those two agencies, and that will give you a really good sense of the sheer scale of how many COs and AOs are at AID versus how many are over at DoD.
There's it's a huge opportunity.
Absolutely. And it's one that I've heard consistently when you talk about, how do you increase local engagement and local ownership? You need bodies to help do that. And that's why, you often see a default towards something else. Jennifer, but
can I add just one thing on that?
Yeah,
Connor?
sure. Richard,
Can I
go right
add one
ahead.
thing? Just it's because the other backdrop in what both Melissa and Paul said a moment ago is that collaboration takes time. And in addition to the fact that the workforce is small, they're most often operating under extremely short timeframes, both in terms of how fast they have to award money. Most people may not know that USAID money expires. In other words, if they have to obligate it and get it out the door within a given fiscal year. And secondly, that the timeframes that we give these grants are quite short. And when you're talking about, say, like trying to change something with regard to maternal child health, you might need a 30-year time frame to see whether or not you actually move the needle on that. But the grant award is maybe 3 to 5 years. So you have a really constrained time period in which to measure and gather evidence.
No, that's another great point, Richard. Jennifer, I do want to give you a chance, though, to get in on this. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Connor. Well, our farmer customers at Corteva are at the heart of everything that we do. You can see from my background, and for farmers, we are 100% committed to enriching the lives of farmers around the world, and whether that's a smallholder farmer in Nigeria or a large soybean farmer in Iowa. We work closely with farmers in their fields every day across the world to provide them agronomic advice, make sure that our technologies are being utilized in the best way possible to allow for the best results for farmers. So I think my colleagues around the world are actually some of the most best technical experts when it comes to understanding the needs of that demographic and that set of beneficiaries in particular. And I think that's one of the things that actually we bring to the table in partnerships, is being able to share that field knowledge and expertise with USAID and other partners in order to be able to formulate the best possible interventions to improve agriculture in various countries. On the topic of co-creation, we've had kind of mixed experiences. We've actually had a really amazing experience in Zambia recently, where we've launched a partnership just last year with Global Communities and John Deere and USAID called the Emerging Farmers Partnership, that leverages over $37 million in financing for inputs, agriculture inputs, mechanization, et cetera. And I think what co-creation allowed in that case was for multiple private sector partners to come to the table to make the most use of everyone's resources and leverage resources in the best possible way in order to have the greatest impact for challenges that we all saw and were aligned on. And we saw an opportunity to come together in order to catalyze investments in the ag industry in Zambia and tackle some of those challenges together. We've also had less great experiences in other places where it should have been a very smooth, easy co-creation process under a fixed obligation grant mechanism, and instead, ended up being a long, drawn out, year and a half long experience that ended up with no future action. So I think the word co-creation, we should make sure we don't end up muddling it down or making it. We should just make sure that I think that it becomes and continues to be a term that people use to really mean coming together hand in hand with partners to co-design something. And I think that it can be a really, really awesome platform for having a great impact on farmers and other beneficiaries in the development sector.
Thanks, Jennifer. That's great. And we are coming up on time here, but we did get one question. There is a question from the audience that I really do want to put to this panel, and I think looks like we might have lost Sarah Glass. But we did have a question, and the question from the audience is, what are some approaches to engagement/collaboration that you think are most successful? Is it more effective, impactful when the private sector is leading the project, or can USAID be a co-creator? And Richard, why don't I start with you? It looks like maybe Sarah Glass is rejoining us, so hopefully just technical difficulties. Sarah, welcome back. I think we're gonna go over time by just a minute or two, so if I can ask everyone to bear with me. Sarah, we did have a question from the audience. Let me read it again, because I think it's an important one. What are some approaches to engagement/collaboration that you think are most successful, more effective/impactful when the private sector leads the project, or can USAID be a co-creator? Richard, would love to get your views, and then maybe we'll go around the room as a lightning round and we can wrap up. So Richard, please lead us off here.
Yeah, absolutely. And just pivoting off of also what Jennifer just said, there's a difference between being co-creative and the formalized method in which some people have approached co-creation at USAID. You can be co-creative without having it take years and years and it being overly complicated. I think the short answer to this question is that, well, as always, is it depends, but that USAID and the private sector can co-create together. It doesn't really necessarily, there's no right answer to one should lead or one should follow. I think what really has to be there, though, is a shared business case where you can really demonstrate that there is an overlap between the development outcomes that USAID is trying, or that any donor is trying to accomplish, and the business objectives. And I really do mean the business objectives, not just the side philanthropy or CSR objectives of a given company. So is there something that they're trying to do, enter a new market, service new customers, lower cost, improve brand reputation? Are there really the solid business case there and that overlap with whatever the donor is trying to accomplish?
Thanks, Richard. Sarah, let's go to you.
Yeah, I agree with Richard, and I think it depends on the problem that you're trying to solve, right? So I saw the recent announcement that the Development Finance Corporation has approved financing for a local African company to manufacture the J&J vaccine in ramping up vaccination efforts to address COVID-19 on the continent of Africa. When you think about the overall problem of addressing COVID-19 on the continent of Africa, that's a public health problem, and makes sense for to be led by government and public health actors, and ideally local government. When you think then about manufacturing a vaccine, right, that's a private sector function, and that makes sense for that to be led by private sector actor, and where financing is needed, where the risk is too high for a public sector actor like the Development Finance Corporation to come in and guarantee that financing and de-risk it. So I really think it depends on the problem and sort of the appropriate role for each actor depending on the nature of the problem.
Jennifer, please, over to you, and then Melissa and Paul will give you two the last word on this.
I agree completely, and I'll just revert back to my earlier comments on relationship building and trust. And I think, better to start just with some good conversations about what the challenges are and what each different organization can bring to the table, and then delve into the bureaucratic, how do we get there efforts.
Melissa, Paul, over to you for the last word.
Paul, I'll give you the last word. And I think a lot of power there. I think it's a push-pull. I think it's, I think there's might be opportunities where the private sector is looking for some help in trying to access a market, as Richard was talking about earlier, through a supply chain or whatever. But I also think something that you spoke of, Jennifer, quickly is relationship building. We have to give, a USAID mission officer, for example, in Brazil, this is, they have a roundtable discussion on, I don't know if it's monthly or quarterly, with private sector partners who aren't necessarily partners yet. And, and having that kind of time to spend getting to know each other, what could we do together, and really just brainstorming initially, where sometimes the mechanisms don't allow for the brainstorming, is a really important piece. So I think, it depends. It's push-pull. It's both. It's either. But I think the emphasis on relationship and building trust is significant.
Thank you, and I underscore what everyone has said. I think in our DNA, as coming from the background of a development actor, there's this idea of don't just stand there, do something. But in order to do an effective engagement, we need to flip that on its head. Don't just do something, stand there for a minute, pause, give time and space to allow co-creation to occur. Because what I've seen, both in the evidence and in my experience, is when there's a pressure to act immediately, co-creation does not maximize its potential. And so I would say what's required that transcends, there's lots of different modalities, there's lots of different ways who leads what. You need time, you need a mutual shared value, you need trust, and you need mutual ownership. So value, ownership, trust, and time to allow that partnership and that creation to get itself established, and then you can do something. So that's what I would say.
That is a great way to end. Thank you, Paul. You did not abuse your final word. I appreciate it. But I want to thank everyone. This has been a great discussion. I want to especially thank my friends at Notre Dame, And Paul and Melissa, you guys have put together a great tool that I really hope is going to have an impact on how we're doing private sector engagement in the future. And a thanks to Jennifer, Sarah, and Richard for their participation on the panel. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. This has been a wonderful discussion. Have a great rest of the day, folks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Connor, for facilitating. Thank you.
Thanks,
All right, take
everyone.
care.